first two veins here are going to be running in the sagittal direction, and they are just going to be named after one on top and one on bottom, and they're called the superior sagittal sinus and the inferior sagittal sinus. One thing you want to note is the inferior sagittal sinus is going to drain into the straight sinus. Now, the straight sinus actually meets up with the superior sagittal sinus and these other ones we'll get to in just a moment at a single location called the confluence of sinuses. Now, that term confluence is a geographical term for when lots of rivers come to a single spot. Now, coming off the confluence of sinus, just moving in the transverse direction is the transverse sinus. And if you'll recall, we learned a structure in the skull called the transverse sulcus. So this vein is going to be sitting in that groove. The transverse sinus will actually start curving around, and when it starts curving around like the letter S, we call that the sigmoid sinus. Now, one thing I also want to note is the sigmoid sinus is going to drain into a structure we've already learned called the internal jugular vein. And so that is how blood goes from the brain back down into circulation, as we've already learned internal jugular and beyond back to the heart in the previous unit. So as we take a look here, this vein on top going in the sagittal plane is the superior sagittal sinus. This one below it is the inferior sagittal sinus, and we see inferior sagittal sinus draining into the straight sinus here. And then they're all going to meet up at that central location right here, which is called the confluence of sinuses, and we'll see a better picture of that here in just a moment. Now, coming off this confluence, we have the transverse sinus going this direction, which starts curving around. At this point, we call it the sigmoid sinus, and then it turns into the internal jugular vein. Now, this diagram here illustrates these veins in a very simple view. Superior sagittal sinus coming in the sagittal direction. Inferior sagittal sinus doing the same thing just below it. Here is straight sinus. Then they all meet up at this central location, the confluence of sinuses. Transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, and then out to the internal jugular vein. From an inferior view, we can see confluence of sinuses right here. Moving out in each direction there is the transverse sinus. Curving around is the sigmoid sinus, which then turns into the internal jugular vein. We still have some internal features we need to figure out of the diencephalon. The first structure is called the hypothalamus. This is a really important region of the diencephalon that you'll learn a whole lot about in physiology. It almost looks like a little triangle in this region. We'll see what that looks like. The hypophyseal stalk is also called the infundibulum. And what this is it's just a connection point between the pituitary gland, which is also called the hypophysis, and it just connects it to the hypothalamus. There will also be two swellings called the mammillary bodies that are part of the diencephalon. The thalamus is going to be an oval-shaped structure, looks kind of like a football almost, that's going to be found in the diencephalon. And in between the two thalmic heads is a structure called the interthalmic adhesion, or you'll also see it called the intermediate mass, and it just allows the two thalmic heads to be able to communicate back and forth. The epithalamus is just a space that's located above the thalamus. We also have the pineal body or pineal gland. This is located posterior in the diencephalon, and this is going to produce a hormone called melatonin, which helps regulate your circadian rhythm or just your sleep cycle. So as we take a look at all these structures, this is a picture of all of these functional units, which we're not really going to be concerned with. But we can see the infundibulum really well right here, connecting the pituitary gland up to the hypothalamus. We also see a really good mammillary body right here, which is this swelling.